In the autumn of 2003, Harlan County, Kentucky had not seen a decent rain in 61 days. The creeks had pulled back from their banks like old men retreating from an argument, and the topsoil on the eastern slopes had gone so dry it cracked open in long crooked lines, the way old porcelain cracks, slowly, quietly, without warning, until one morning you just notice it's broken. The county extension office reported that 42% of small farms in the area had missed their second mortgage payment that year. Tobacco, which had fed these hills for 150 years, was dying not just from drought but from a market that had finally decided it no longer needed what these people had spent generations learning to grow. It was in that autumn, in that county, on a hillside that nobody wanted, that Nora Calloway came home. She was 34 years old when she pulled her rusted Chevy Silverado up the gravel lane that led to her father's place. The truck had 212,000 miles on it and a crack in the windshield that had been spreading slowly since Ohio, and she drove with both hands on the wheel the way her father had taught her, not because the road required it, but because he said a person who drove careless thought careless, and careless thinking killed farms faster than any drought ever could. Her father, Dale Calloway, was standing on the porch when she arrived. He was 67 years old and looked like something the land itself had shaped, wide shoulders gone a little soft, hands like knotted rope, a face tanned to the color of good leather. He watched her park the truck and climb out without saying anything, the way he always watched things, with a patience that some people mistook for coldness. "Daddy," she said. "Nora," he said back. That was the whole reunion. She had been in Oregon for 9 years, working first at an agricultural research station outside Corvallis, then consulting for a specialty crop cooperative that worked with small growers across the Pacific Northwest. She had studied things Dale Calloway had never heard of: soil bioavailability, elevation microclimates, alternative allium cultivation. She had read papers published in journals with names that meant nothing to a man who had learned farming by walking behind his own father through these same fields at age 6, barefoot, carrying a tobacco stick twice as tall as he was. Dale had called her in July, not to ask for help, he would never do that, but to tell her that the bank had sent a man out. A young man in a clean truck with a clipboard and a sympathetic smile, who had walked the property and taken photographs and told Dale in a gentle voice that they would need to discuss restructuring the loan. Dale had used the word restructuring the way most men use profanity, spitting it out with a particular kind of contempt. But he had called Nora, and that meant something. He never called anyone. The farm was 208 acres, most of it hill and hollow, with maybe 60 acres of flat bottomland along Cane Creek that had been workable tobacco ground back when tobacco was still the answer to everything. The house was a white farmhouse that had been white so long it had gone the color of old teeth. The barn behind it was red, or had been, now it was the color of dried blood, the paint peeling in long strips that curled away from the boards like the skin off a sunburned shoulder. There was a 1979 John Deere 4440 tractor in the equipment shed that Dale maintained the way other men maintained religion, with devotion, with ritual, with the belief that if you kept faith with it, it would not fail you when you needed it most. Nora walked the property the next morning before her father was awake. She went out at 5:30 with a flashlight and her old mud boots, the ones she'd left in the closet 9 years ago, and found exactly where she'd left them, because Dale Calloway did not move things that belonged to people. She walked down through the bottomland first, shining the light on the soil, crouching down and picking up handfuls of it and letting it run through her fingers. It was dry. Drier than she'd expected. The kind of dry that took years to undo, not just one good rain. The tobacco ground had been worked hard for decades, and the soil had the tired, depleted look of land that had been asked to give everything and had finally run out of everything to give. Then she climbed the hill. It was the eastern hillside, the one her father always called worthless. It ran up at a steep angle behind the barn, maybe 30 acres of it, rocky and thin-soiled and impossible to work with any equipment larger than a walk-behind tiller. Tobacco had never grown there. Nothing commercial had ever grown there. When she was a child, her father would wave at it dismissively whenever anyone mentioned it. "Worthless ground," he'd say. "Good for rocks and snakes and not a thing else." He had said it so many times over so many years that everyone who knew the Calloway farm simply accepted it as fact, the way you accept that a river runs a certain direction, not because you've tested it, but because you've been told it your whole life. But Nora stood on that hillside in the early dark and felt something different. The elevation was right. She had known that from maps she'd studied in Oregon, sitting at her kitchen table with a topographic printout and a cup of coffee, tracing the contours of the land she'd grown up on with her finger. The slope faced east-southeast, which meant morning sun and afternoon shade. The thin rocky soil drained almost perfectly. And the nights in this hollow ran cold. She remembered that from childhood, remembered waking up in September to frost on the grass when the bottomland was still warm. She crouched down and dug her fingers into the hillside soil. Even in drought, there was something alive in it. A smell she recognized. She knew what she wanted to do. She also knew what her father would say. She went back to the house and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, and when Dale came downstairs at 6:15 she had a cup waiting for him. He sat down across from her and wrapped both hands around the mug the way he always did, even in summer, as if the warmth was something he needed to hold on to. "I walked the property," she said. "I figured you would. The bottomland's in trouble. The soil's exhausted. Even if you get rain, it'll take years to build it back." He looked at his coffee. "I know that." "The hillside," she started. "Worthless ground," he said, not unkindly, just as a matter of fact. "I don't think so." He looked up at her then, and there was something in his face, not anger, not yet, but the first movement toward it, the way clouds build before a storm. "Nora, I've farmed that ground for 40 years. You farmed around it for 40 years. Nobody's ever actually tried the hillside." Silence. Dale drank his coffee. "I want to try Saffron," she said. He set the mug down. Looked at her for a long moment the way he looked at whether he didn't trust. "Saffron," he said. "Like the spice." "Like the spice. That's a Persian thing. It grows in Iran, Spain, Kashmir. And in parts of the Appalachians, it turns out. Pennsylvania growers have had success. There are operations in Vermont. The climate conditions on that hillside, the drainage, the elevation, the cold nights, they're closer to saffron growing regions than you'd think. You can't make a living on saffron in Harlan County. Daddy, you can't make a living on tobacco in Harlan County. Not anymore." Another silence. Longer this time. Outside the kitchen window, the sky was going from black to the deep blue that comes just before dawn breaks, and the silhouette of the barn stood against it like something solid and permanent. "It's my land," Dale said finally. "I know that. I'm not signing anything over. I'm not asking you to." He picked up his coffee again. "You'd be wasting your time." "Maybe," she said. "Can I try anyway?" He didn't answer. He finished his coffee, stood up, put the mug in the sink, and went out the back door to start his morning chores. And Nora sat there at the table and understood that in Dale Calloway's language, not saying no was the same as saying yes. She started that October. Saffron comes from the Crocus sativus plant, a small bulb that blooms in autumn rather than spring, which means it flowers when most of the farming world is winding down. The spice itself comes from the stigmas, 3 thin red threads inside each flower, and must be harvested by hand, each stigma plucked individually with patience that borders on meditation. 1 pound of dry saffron requires somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 flowers. The work is slow, quiet, and intensely detailed, which is why most commercial saffron production happens in places where labor is cheap. The reason American saffron was rare wasn't the climate. It was the assumption. Nora had ordered her first corms, 5,000 of them, from a specialty grower in Pennsylvania while she was still on the road from Oregon. They arrived in cardboard boxes packed in dry peat, small brown bulbs the size of large marbles, unremarkable-looking things that gave no indication of what they were capable of. She carried them up the hillside in a canvas bag over her shoulder, working in the October cool, and planted them by hand in rows she'd laid out with stakes and string, spacing them 4 inches apart in shallow furrows she dug with a hand tool. The soil was rocky enough that she worked around the stones rather than removing them, because she'd read that stones helped regulate soil temperature in exactly the way saffron needed. Every piece of that hillside that her father had dismissed as a defect was something she had learned to read as an asset. Dale watched from the bottom of the hill on the second day. Just stood there by the fence post with his arms crossed, watching her work her way along the rows. He didn't say anything. She didn't look up. After a while she heard his boots on the gravel going back toward the barn, and she kept planting. Her first conversation with the county extension agent, a heavy-set man named Gerald Pruitt who had run the office for 20 years and knew every farm in the county by heart, did not go especially well. "Saffron," Gerald said, sitting back in his chair the way men sit when they're trying to be polite about disagreeing. "That's an interesting idea, Nora. I think the hillside conditions are right. I don't doubt they might be. What I wonder about is the market side. You know how these things go, a grower tries something specialty, puts in the work, gets a harvest, and then finds out nobody around here knows how to buy it or sell it. I'm not selling locally. Not to start. Where then? Online, direct to restaurants, and through a specialty food cooperative I've already been in contact with. There's demand. American saffron, domestic, small batch, traceable, it commands a premium. I've seen it sell for $8-9 a gram." Gerald whistled low. "That's assuming you get a harvest." "That's always the assumption," she said. He leaned forward. "How's your daddy taking it?" She smiled a little. "About how you'd expect." Gerald shook his head slowly, but there was something in his face, not dismissal, exactly. More like the look of a man who has seen enough surprising things in farming to know that surprising things are possible, even if he wouldn't bet on them himself. "You need anything from our office, you let me know," he said. "I mean that." She drove back to the farm through the hollow roads, past other people's fields that were dry and brown and tired looking in the gray October light. Past the Hensley farm, where Bill Hensley had sold off his equipment the previous spring and was now driving a delivery truck 3 days a week out of Middlesboro. Past the old Combs place, which had been in the Combs family since 1887 and was now for sale, a realtor's sign at the end of the lane looking deeply out of place against the backdrop of the old homestead. She thought about what it meant to be from a place. Not just to have grown up there, but to be from it, the way a tree is from the soil it grows in. She had left. She had needed to leave, needed the education, the experience, the years of learning things that couldn't be learned here. But she had never stopped being from this hollow, from this county, from this particular thin-soiled hillside that everyone had spent 40 years calling worthless. And she thought there was something in that, something about knowing a place from the inside, from the marrow of your childhood, that no amount of outside expertise could fully replace. The corms settled into the hillside through October and into the first week of November. And then, in the way of saffron, which is theatrical about its timing, the blooms came. She was up before dawn when she saw the first ones, small purple flowers pushing up through the thin soil with an improbable determination, delicate looking but not delicate, the way certain small things are tougher than they appear. By mid-morning there were hundreds of them open along the top rows. By the following day, thousands. The hillside that had spent 40 years being called worthless was covered in purple from the fence line to the tree line, and in the center of each bloom were 3 red threads so vivid they looked like they'd been painted there. Dale saw them from the barn. Nora was up the hill with her harvest basket, moving slowly along the rows, pinching each stigma with her thumb and forefinger, the way she'd practiced for months, careful not to damage the flower or the corn beneath. She heard his boots on the gravel and then the sound of him climbing the hill, which he didn't do often anymore because his left knee had gone arthritic. She didn't stop working. She heard him come up behind her and stop. He stood there for a long time looking at the hillside. "Well," he said finally. "Well," she agreed. He didn't say anything else. But she heard him behind her, moving along the next row, and when she glanced back she saw him crouching down and looking at the blooms the way he looked at everything that interested him, with a slow, serious attention, his big scarred hands held carefully away from the flowers as if he already understood they were something that required gentleness. The first-year harvest was small. 2,000 flowers yielded less than half a gram of dry saffron, which Nora had expected. The corms needed a year to settle, to spread, to multiply. She had planted 5,000. By the following autumn she would have more. By year 3, if everything went right, the corms would have multiplied enough to cover the full hillside. She packaged what she had in small glass vials she'd ordered online, dark glass, the kind that protected the spice from light, and sent samples to 4 restaurants, 2 in Lexington, 1 in Cincinnati, 1 in Nashville. She included a 1-page letter she had written carefully, not as a sales pitch but as a story. The story of the hillside. The story of the county. The story of soil that everyone had written off. The Nashville restaurant wrote back in 2 weeks. The chef's name was a woman named Priya Mehta, and she wrote in a voice that matched Nora's, direct, precise, deeply interested in where food came from. She wanted to know everything. How the corms were sourced. How the harvest was done. What the soil profile looked like. Whether Nora could supply consistently. She was willing to pay $12 per gram, which was more than Nora had asked for, and she wanted first right of refusal on the following year's harvest. Nora read the email 3 times at the kitchen table. Then she went to find her father. He was in the equipment shed, doing what he did every November, going through the 4440, checking and cleaning and adjusting, preparing it for winter the way you prepare a living thing for hard weather. He had his back to her when she came in, bent over the engine with a wrench and a shop rag. "I've got a buyer," she said. He straightened up slowly. Turned around. For the Saffron. Nashville restaurant. $12 a gram. He looked at her for a moment, calculating. She could see him doing the math, the way farmers do math, not with paper but with a kind of internal accounting that runs constantly in the back of the farming mind, assets and liabilities and probabilities shuffling like cards. "How much you get this year?" "Half a gram, give or take." "It's a first year. Next year will be more." He turned back to the engine. "Half a gram's not going to save this farm." "I know that. But it's a start." "Starting doesn't feed a banknote." "No," she said. "But the USDA specialty crop grant I applied for last month might help with the note while the planting scales up." He stopped moving. Still had his back to her. "You applied for a grant." 2 weeks ago. "Gerald Pruitt helped me with the paperwork. There's a program specifically for alternative crop transition on marginal land. We qualify on almost every point." Silence. The sound of the wind outside moving around the corner of the equipment shed. A crow somewhere, calling once and then going quiet. "You could have told me," he said. "You would have said no." A long pause. "Probably," he admitted. She went back to the house. He stayed in the shed with his tractor. But that night at dinner, the first dinner they'd eaten together since she arrived that had not been eaten in near complete silence, he asked her about the grant. How much? What the terms were. What they'd have to demonstrate. She answered every question directly, and he listened the way he always listened, without expression, absorbing information like dry ground takes water. When she finished, he nodded once, ate the last of his potatoes, and said, "All right." 2 words. But from Dale Calloway, 2 words could contain whole agreements. The winter was hard. Not in dramatic ways, no blizzards, no ice storms, nothing that would make news. Just the gray, grinding cold of a Kentucky hollow in January, when the sky sits low and the bare trees look like dark cracks in it, and the ground freezes and thaws and freezes again in cycles that are hard on the body and harder on the spirit. Nora spent those months planning. She read everything she could find about saffron cultivation at scale. She joined 2 online grower networks, one in Vermont, one in Pennsylvania, and spent hours in email correspondence with growers who had been doing this for 5 and 10 years, asking questions, sharing notes, building relationships that she knew would matter later. She also spent those months learning her father. Not relearning him, she had never stopped knowing him, exactly. But there is a difference between knowing someone as a daughter knows a father and knowing them as one farmer knows another, and that winter she began to understand the second kind. She watched how he read the weather, how he walked the bottomland after a freeze and crouched down to check the soil, how he noted the angle of water drainage after a thaw. He had knowledge stored in his body that had never been written anywhere. Knowledge that had passed from his father to him and that he had expected to pass to a son. He and Nora's mother had lost a boy in infancy, before Nora was born, and she understood now, in a way she hadn't as a child, how much of what her father carried had always been meant for someone who never came. She asked him once, in February, what he knew about the East Hillside. They were sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the wood stove going, and she asked it the way you ask something you've been thinking about for a while, quietly, without making it into a big thing. He thought about it. "Granddad tried tobacco up there once," he said. "Before my time. Story I heard is it was the best tobacco he ever grew. But the pickers wouldn't work it because the slope was too steep. Wasn't worth the trouble when they had plenty of flat ground." Nora was quiet for a moment. "So it wasn't worthless ground?" "No," he said, simply. "Just inconvenient ground. Different thing." She thought about that for a long time. In April, she ordered 12,000 additional corms. The grant had come through $11,000, which was not a fortune but was enough to cover the bank payment through the growing season and buy the supplies she needed. The grant officer who called to inform her had seemed mildly surprised that the application had been for Saffron, in Kentucky, on a hillside that the county had long since written off. Nora had thanked her and hung up and sat very still for a moment in the kitchen, listening to the sound of the farm around her, the creak of the barn in the April wind, the sound of water moving in Cane Creek after spring rains that had finally, gratefully come. She told Gerald Pruitt about the grant at his office, and he leaned back in his chair with a look that was partly surprised and partly something else. Respect, maybe. The kind that comes slow but comes real. 11,000, he said. Yes. That's not nothing. No, she agreed. Nora. He paused, choosing words. I've been running this office for 22 years. I've seen a lot of people try a lot of things on land that wasn't working. Most of them, and I say this with all the respect in the world, they try it once, it doesn't work the first year, and they give up. You understand what you're in for. I grew up in Harlan County, she said. I know what giving up looks like and I know what it costs. He nodded slowly. All right then. The second autumn bloom was something else entirely. 12,000 corms, plus the 5,000 from the previous year that had multiplied underground through the winter, covered nearly 2/3 of the hillside. The purple came in waves, the way it does with saffron, the whole slope going from bare soil to full bloom over the course of about 2 weeks in October, and it stopped people. Literally stopped them. She saw cars slow on the county road below, drivers craning their necks to look up at the hillside that had always been nothing but scrub and rock and now looked like something from a painting. Betty Sizemore, who ran the post office and had lived in the county her whole life, drove up the lane unannounced one morning to ask if she was seeing things correctly. Is that Saffron? Betty said, standing in the driveway and shading her eyes to look up the hill. It is, Nora said. I didn't know saffron grew here. Neither did I, until I looked into it. Betty shook her head slowly. She was a small woman in her 60s, with white hair and sharp eyes and the kind of practicality that comes from having watched a lot of things happen in a small town over many decades. Your daddy must be something, she said. He's adjusting, Nora said. Betty laughed a short, genuine sound. I imagine he is. The harvest that second year took 3 weeks. Nora hired 2 women from the county, Margaret Holbrook, whose family farm had been sold at auction the previous spring, and a quiet young woman named Cassie Deal who had never farmed but had hands like an artist and picked up the delicate work immediately. The 3 of them moved along the rows every morning before the blooms opened too wide, plucking stigmas, filling small collection trays, working in the cool early light with a concentration that felt almost ceremonial. Nora had read that in Iran, saffron harvest was a community event, families and neighbors gathering at dawn, moving through the fields together, singing sometimes. She understood now why that was. The work created its own kind of intimacy. Dale came up the hill on the 4th morning of harvest. His knee had been bad all week, and she heard him working his way up the slope carefully, one hand on the fence wire. He didn't say he was coming to help. He just arrived, and crouched down at the end of a row, and began picking with his big careful hands, and the 3 women moved over to give him room, and no one said anything about it because there was nothing that needed to be said. The second year harvest yielded 6 grams of dry saffron. At $12 a gram, Nora had 3 buyers by then, including a high-end grocery cooperative in Lexington that wanted to carry it under a Kentucky-grown label. The gross was $72. Still not a living. Still not enough to do more than make a small dent in what the farm owed. But saffron is a long game. The corms multiply every year. What you plant doubles, triples, continues to spread. The relationship between the first year and the fifth year is not linear, it's exponential, the way anything alive grows if you give it what it needs and leave it alone. By year 3, Nora had nearly 50,000 corms in the ground. By year 4, the entire hillside was planted, end to end, and what had been 30 acres of worthless rock was 30 acres of saffron field, and in October it turned purple the way the Great Smoky Mountains turn orange in fall, completely, magnificently, in a way that seemed to say, "This is what I was always capable of, if someone had only known to ask." It was in the 4th year that things began to change in a way that people in the county could see and measure. The harvest that autumn was 22 grams. At an average of $14 a gram, her prices had risen as her reputation grew. That was just over $300 gross, which after costs netted to something that was, finally, a real number. Not enough to make Dale Calloway rich, but enough to cover the farm's operating costs for the year. Enough, combined with a small lease payment from a neighbor who ran cattle on the bottomland Nora had let rest for 3 years, to make the banknote with money left over. The man from the bank, a different man now, younger, who had grown up in the county and knew the Calloway name, drove out in October that year not to take photographs and talk about restructuring but to bring paperwork that showed the loan was current and to ask, with genuine curiosity, if he could walk the hillside. Nora took him up. He stood at the top and looked down across the slope, 30 acres of purple and green in the October light, Cane Creek glinting silver at the bottom of the hollow, the old white farmhouse and the old red barn sitting solid and permanent as they had sat for 80 years. He was quiet for a long time. "My granddad used to tell me about this farm," he said finally. "Said it was the prettiest hollow in the county." "It is," Nora said. He looked at her sideways. "What made you think Saffron would work here?" "The hillside told me," she said. And then, because that sounded mysterious and she didn't mean it to, she added, "The elevation, the drainage, the cold nights. The conditions were right. They'd always been right. Nobody had thought to look at them that way." He nodded. "Took one more look at the slope. My office is getting calls from other growers in the area asking about transition loans. People who've heard about what you're doing here." "I know," she said. "I've been talking to some of them. 3 farms in the county would plant saffron the following spring, using corms they bought from Nora at a fair price. She had enough surplus now to supply them and still have more than she needed. She wrote up simple growing guides based on what she'd learned and gave them away for free. Gerald Pruitt had asked her to present at a county extension meeting in November, and she had done it without notes, standing at the front of a community room full of farmers who looked at her with varying degrees of skepticism and interest, and she had spoken plainly, without performance, about soil and drainage and patience and the long math of specialty crops. An old farmer named Curtis Webb, who had been farming the same 300 acres since 1971 and had a face like a topographic map, had waited until everyone else left and then come up to her and said, "My east field runs along a ridge I've never been able to do anything with. You think it's worth looking at?" "Everything's worth looking at," she'd said. It was in the 5th year that her father said the thing he had been working his way toward since she came home. They were sitting on the porch in the evening of the last day of harvest, both of them tired in the good deep way that physical work tires a person, the kind of tired that feels like accomplishment. The sun was going down behind the western ridge and the sky was going through its stages, orange, then deep pink, then a blue that darkened by slow degrees until the first stars appeared. The hillside was quiet now, the blooms picked clean for the season, the corms settling back into the soil to multiply through winter. Dale had a glass of sweet tea. He'd stopped drinking anything stronger 20 years ago after his heart had given him a warning, and sweet tea had become his evening ritual, the same glass at the same time, sitting in the same chair on the same porch. He looked at the hillside for a long time. "I was wrong," he said. She looked at him. "About the hillside," he said. "I was wrong about it. I told you it was worthless and I said it so many times I stopped questioning it. That was lazy thinking." He paused. "Your granddad used to say that the worst thing a farmer can do is decide something is impossible before he's tried it. I forgot that somewhere along the way." Nora didn't say anything for a moment. The evening around them was very quiet, the way evenings in a hollow can be, a deep, encompassing quiet that is not absence of sound but fullness of it, every cricket and rustle and distant creek running together into something that felt almost like silence. "You kept the farm," she said. "For 40 years, through everything, you kept it." "I kept the flat part," he said. "You kept the whole thing." She reached over and put her hand on his arm, on the knotted rope of his forearm, and he didn't pull away the way he might have once. He sat with it. They sat together on the porch in the darkening evening and didn't say anything else, and that was enough. It was more than enough, it was everything, the way the best things between a parent and a child are often the things that happen in silence. In the 6th year, Nora Calloway's Saffron farm made more than $40,000 gross. She had scaled to partnership with 7 restaurants across Kentucky and Tennessee, a wholesale agreement with a regional specialty food distributor, and a small online shop where she sold directly to home cooks across the country who had found her through word of mouth and a single article in a regional food magazine that had described the Hillside as one of the most unlikely and remarkable agricultural transformations in Appalachian history. She had not sought that description. It had come from a writer who drove down from Lexington to walk the hillside and spent most of the afternoon sitting at the kitchen table talking to Dale, who turned out, improbably, to be the better interview subject. His memory for the county's agricultural history was encyclopedic, and once he trusted the writer enough to talk freely, he told stories that were worth telling. The article had run in October, during bloom season, accompanied by photographs that did what photographs of the hillside always did to people who hadn't seen it: stop them where they stood. Margaret Holbrook had been working the harvest full-time for 3 years by then. Cassie Deal had started a saffron patch on her own family's land, 4 acres of hillside that had gone unused, using corms and knowledge she'd gained working for Nora. 2 other women from the county had come to work harvests and learn the work, drawn by wages that were better than anything else available in the hollow and by something harder to name, the particular pull of work that is delicate and skilled and matters, that leaves you at the end of the day with something real in your hands. There were mornings, in the 3rd week of October, when Nora would stand at the bottom of the hillside before sunrise with her harvest basket and look up at the field she had built from worthless ground and feel something she could not quite name. Not pride, exactly, pride felt too small, too self-centered for what she felt. Something more like rightness. The feeling of something being in its proper place. The hillside had always been capable of this. The knowledge of what it needed had always existed somewhere, in journals, in the memories of growers on other continents, in the logic of the soil itself. All it had needed was someone willing to stand on it and ask the right questions, and to keep asking them through years of small harvests and tight banknotes and the steady low hum of other people's doubt. She thought about her father's father, who had grown the best tobacco he ever grew on that same slope and had to abandon it because the work of harvesting it was inconvenient. She thought about all the years the hillside had sat unused, growing rock and scrub and the particular patience of neglected land. She thought about what the hill might have said, if hills could speak, not complaint, but quiet persistence. I am still here. I have not stopped being what I am. Come back when you are ready. The morning she thought about most, though, the one she would carry longest, was the morning in October of the 5th year, 2 weeks before the harvest was finished, when her father had come up the hill before she arrived. She had been down at the barn checking on something, and when she came up the lane she could see him there, at the top of the slope, moving along the rows in the early light. He moved slowly because of the knee, but carefully, and she could see from the way his shoulders were set that he was paying attention, the deep, whole-body attention he gave to things that mattered to him. He was picking stigmas. Working a row she hadn't yet touched, his big careful hands doing the small precise work, alone on the hillside in the quiet October morning. She had stood at the bottom of the slope and watched him for a while before she climbed up. He didn't look up when she joined him. Just moved over to give her the next row. They worked in silence, the way they had always done the best work between them, and around them the purple hillside opened in the morning light, 30 acres of something that no one had believed in until it existed, and the county road below them was still, and the creek was running, and somewhere in the hollow a crow called once and then was quiet. There are things that take a long time to prove. Not because the proof is complicated, but because the people who need convincing have spent a long time learning not to look at the evidence. Nora Calloway had spent 6 years proving that a hillside everyone called worthless was worth something. She had done it not by arguing, not by demanding to be taken seriously, but by the oldest and most stubborn method available to a person, by doing the work, season after season, in full sight of everyone who doubted her, until the work itself made the argument. And in the autumn of 2009, in Harlan County, Kentucky, with the hillside in full bloom and the air carrying the faint, particular smell of saffron, an ancient smell, something that had crossed centuries and continents to settle on this improbable slope, Nora Calloway stood in the middle of 30 acres of purple and let it be enough. Let it be exactly what it was, not a miracle, not a fairy tale, but the patient outcome of good knowledge applied to good land by a woman who had never stopped believing the two deserved each other. Her father was behind her, a row over, picking. The county road below was empty. The old white farmhouse sat solid in the morning light. And the hillside, the worthless, rocky, impossible hillside, was alive with color from the fence line to the tree line, doing exactly what it had always been capable of doing, in the only language that land ever speaks, by growing.